It was 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in October 2019, and 23-year-old Keith Ryan was standing behind the counter of the Starlight gas station in rural Nebraska, trying desperately to stay awake. The Starlight was situated on a lonely stretch of highway, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by endless fields of corn that rustled loudly in the wind. Keith was the only employee on duty, which was standard for the graveyard shift. Usually, this was the easiest job in the world. He would just sit on his stool, play games on his phone, and maybe ring up a trucker or two who came in for coffee. But on this particular night, the silence of the store felt heavy, almost oppressive. Keith had his headphones in, listening to a podcast when he felt a strange sensation, like the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. He paused his podcast and took out his earbuds, listening for whatever had spooked him. At first, he heard nothing but the hum of the refrigerators and the distant rattle of the wind outside. But then, he heard a distinct wet slap sound right in front of him. He looked down at the counter and his blood ran cold. Sitting there, directly in the center of the Formica countertop, where nothing had been just seconds before, was a raw, severed chicken foot. Keith jumped back, knocking his stool over, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked around the store wildly, expecting to see a prankster hiding in the candy aisle or maybe a customer who had snuck in without the door chime ringing. But the store was completely empty. The glass doors were locked from the inside because Keith always locked them at 3 a.m. for safety. He was alone, completely alone in a locked building, yet someone or something had just placed a dead animal part inches from his hand. This story sounds like a horror movie trope, the kind of thing you see in a slasher film, but it is 100% true. And what happened next would force Keith to question his sanity and eventually fight for his life against an intruder who knew the gas station better than he did. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place, because that is all we do. And we upload very often, so if that is of interest to you, please offer the like button a ride to the airport, but drop them off at the wrong terminal 5 minutes before their flight departs. Also, please subscribe to the Cypher Story on YouTube so you do not miss any of our uploads. Okay, let us get into today's story. To understand how terrifying this night shift actually was, we need to go back about 6 weeks to when Keith Ryan first started working at the Starlight gas station. Keith was a college student at a community college about 40 minutes away, and like most students, he was broke. He needed a job that would pay his tuition and rent, but he also needed a job that would allow him to study. Keith was a bit of an introvert. He did not like dealing with crowds or angry customers in retail, so when he saw the ad for a graveyard shift attendant at a remote gas station, he thought it was perfect. The pay was decent because nobody wanted to work the hours from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and the owner, a gruff older man named Mr. Henderson, promised Keith that he would basically be getting paid to do his homework. Mr. Henderson told him, "Look, kid, the place is a ghost town at night. You might get 3 cars total. Just sweep the floors, stock the coolers, and keep the coffee fresh. Other than that, I don't care what you do." For the first month, the job was exactly as advertised. Keith fell into a comfortable routine. He would arrive at 11 p.m., relieve the evening shift guy, and then lock himself in his little bubble of light. The Starlight was an older building, built probably in the 80s, with fluorescent lights that buzzed constantly and a drop ceiling made of those fibrous square tiles that are stained with water spots. The place had a weird smell, a mix of stale donuts, gasoline, and industrial cleaner, but Keith didn't mind. He would set up his laptop on the counter next to the lottery ticket machine and work on his essays, occasionally staring out the front window into the pitch-black darkness of the cornfields across the road. The isolation was intense out there on the highway. There were no streetlights. The only light came from the gas station canopy and the big spinning star sign out front. Beyond that, it was just an abyss. Sometimes Keith would watch coyotes trot across the parking lot or see moths swarming the lights, but humans were rare. Usually it was just long-haul truckers who looked exhausted and just wanted a pack of cigarettes and a bathroom key. Keith never felt unsafe because the station had a security system. There were cameras in every aisle and a monitor behind the counter where Keith could see everything. And there was a heavy deadbolt on the front door, which he kept locked during the slowest hours, making customers talk to him through the night window if they wanted something. But around the 5th week, things started to get weird. It began with subtle things that Keith brushed off as his mind playing tricks on him. When you're tired and alone at 3 a.m., your brain can do funny things. One night, Keith was stocking the cooler at the back of the store. He had a cart full of Gatorade and sodas, and he was organizing the shelves, making sure the labels faced forward. He was back there for maybe 20 minutes with his back to the main store. While he was working, he heard a thud come from the front near the register. It sounded like something heavy falling off a shelf. Keith froze. He listened for the door chime, thinking maybe someone was messing with him. Silence. Keith checked the security monitor, looking at the playback from the last 5 minutes. The video showed the empty store, nothing moving, and then, suddenly, the can of beans just rolled into the frame of aisle 3 from off-camera. It didn't fall from the ceiling. It rolled, as if someone had bowled it across the floor. Keith rewound the footage again, trying to see where it came from, but the angle was blind. The camera covered the aisle, but not the gap between the shelves. Keith tried to rationalize it. Maybe the building settled. Maybe the vibrations from a passing truck shook the shelf, and the can rolled weirdly. He put the beans back and went back to his post behind the counter, telling himself to stop being paranoid. 2 nights later, the gifts started appearing. Keith had a habit of bringing a specific type of pen to work, a nice gel pen that he used for his homework. He left it on the counter when he went to the bathroom. He was gone for maybe 3 minutes. When he came back, the pen was gone. Keith looked everywhere, thinking he knocked it onto the floor. He checked his pockets, nothing. He checked the trash, nothing. Feeling annoyed, he grabbed a cheap Bic pen from the cup and went back to work. An hour later, he went to brew a fresh pot of coffee. When he returned to the counter, his nice gel pen was sitting right there in the center of the counter, perfectly parallel to the register. Keith stared at the pen, his mouth dry. He knew he had checked the counter. He knew it wasn't there before. He checked the security footage again. On the screen, he saw himself leave for the bathroom. He saw the empty counter, and then the video glitched, just a split second of static. And when the image stabilized, the pen was there. Keith felt a shiver go down his spine. He called Mr. Henderson the next morning and asked if the cameras were malfunctioning. Mr. Henderson just grunted and said the system was old and sometimes it skipped frames. "Don't worry about it," he said. But Keith was worrying about it. The glitch happened exactly when the object appeared. It felt too convenient, too targeted. Over the next few nights, more objects appeared and disappeared. Keith would bring a bag of chips, turn his back, and it would vanish, finding it later inside the freezer, looking crushed. He would find weird items on the counter that didn't belong in the store. A rusty screw, a distinct gray button from a shirt, a dead moth, perfectly intact. Keith started to feel like he was being watched constantly. The sensation of eyes on him was so strong that he started bringing a baseball bat to work, keeping it under the counter. He stopped wearing his headphones so he could hear every creak and groan of the building. He stopped doing homework. Instead, he spent his shift staring at the security monitor, cycling through the cameras, looking for something. Then came the night of the chicken foot, the night the story truly escalated. Keith was sitting there, trying to stay calm after the chicken foot appeared. He had thrown the gruesome thing in the outside dumpster, using a pair of tongs, refusing to touch it with his bare hands. He had locked the door and double-checked it. He had searched every inch of the store, armed with his bat, checking the bathroom, the storage closet, the walk-in cooler. Nobody was there. He returned to the counter, his nerves frayed. He texted his girlfriend saying, "I think this place is haunted, or I am losing my mind." She texted back telling him to quit, but Keith needed the money. He told himself he just had to make it to 7 a.m. when the morning shift girl, Sarah, arrived. At 4:30 a.m., Keith was standing near the magazine rack, straightening up the automotive magazines, when he heard a sound that was different from the usual building noises. It was a scraping sound, like heavy fabric dragging across something rough, and it was coming from above him. Keith froze, looking up at the drop ceiling. The tiles were those standard acoustic squares suspended in a metal grid. They were old and stained yellow from years of cigarette smoke, back when you could smoke inside. As Keith watched, one of the tiles near the center of the store shifted. It lifted up, maybe an inch, just enough for the black darkness above it to be visible, and then it settled back down into place with a soft clack. Keith's breath hitched. He backed away slowly, moving towards the safety of the counter. His mind raced. Rats! It had to be rats. Or maybe raccoons got into the roof space. That would explain the noises. Maybe the vibrations caused things to fall. But it didn't explain the chicken foot, or the can of beans, or the pen. Rats don't return lost pens. Keith grabbed the broom handle and walked cautiously towards the center of the store. He stood under the tile that had moved and poked it with the handle, pushing it up. The tile lifted easily, revealing the dark crawl space above. "Hey!" Keith shouted, his voice cracking. "Is anyone up there?" Silence, just the hum of the ridge and the wind outside. Keith stood there for a moment, feeling ridiculous, shouting at a ceiling, expecting an answer. He lowered the broom and the tile fell back into place. He went back to the counter and sat down, keeping his eyes glued to that spot in the ceiling. He decided to check the camera that pointed at that section of the store. On the monitor, the image was grainy, black and white, but he could clearly see the grid of the ceiling. He watched the monitor intently, waiting for it to move again. And then he saw it. On the monitor, in the corner of the frame, near the ventilation duct, a hand, a human hand, pale and dirty, reached down from a different tile. The hand gripped the metal frame of the grid as if testing it for weight, and then, slowly, silently, a face lowered itself into the gap. Keith spun around in his chair, looking at the actual ceiling spot where the camera was showing the intruder, but in the real world, the tile was flush. Nothing was there. Keith looked back at the monitor. The face was there, on the screen, staring directly into the camera lens with wide, unblinking eyes. It was a man, gaunt and bearded, his face smeared with grease or dirt. He was looking right at the camera, smiling, a twisted, broken smile. Keith realized with a jolt of pure horror that the camera feed was on a delay. Or, no, he looked closer. The timestamp on the monitor said 4:32 a.m. The current time was 4:45 a.m. The system was lagging, playing back footage from 15 minutes ago, which meant that 15 minutes ago, while Keith was standing right there, looking at magazines, that man had been looking down at Keith. Keith grabbed his phone to dial 911, but as he unlocked the screen, he heard a massive crash from the back of the store, near the storage room door. He looked up and saw the storage room door, which was always locked, swinging wide open, darkness spilling out from within. And then the power to the entire gas station cut out, plunging Keith into absolute pitch black. The absolute darkness. The absolute darkness inside the Starlight. The blackout wasn't just a flickering of lights, it was a total shutdown. The hum of the refrigerators died instantly, the buzz of the fluorescent bulbs ceased, and the only light came from the faint red glow of the emergency exit sign above the front door, and the moonlight filtering in through the glass windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the linoleum floor. Keith was standing behind the counter, paralyzed, his hand gripping his phone so hard his knuckles were white. His heart was beating so loud he could hear the blood rushing in his ears, thumping like a war drum. He frantically tapped the screen of his phone, trying to turn on the flashlight app. His fingers were shaking so badly he dropped the phone on the counter. It clattered loudly in the silence, sounding like a gunshot. Keith gasped and scrambled to grab it, finally managing to swipe up and hit the flashlight icon. A beam of stark white LED light cut through the darkness, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Keith swept the light across the store. "Who was there?" he screamed, his voice cracking. "I have a bat, and I've called the police." This was a lie. He hadn't hit send on the call yet, but he hoped the threat would be enough to scare whoever was back there. But there was no answer from the storage room. Instead, there was a sound that came from directly above his head. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was the sound of knees and hands crawling rapidly across the metal grid of the drop ceiling. It wasn't the slow, careful movement from before. This was fast, aggressive movement. Whoever was up there was rushing towards the front of the store, towards the counter, towards Keith. Keith aimed his flashlight up at the ceiling tiles, watching as they buckled and shifted under the weight of something heavy. Dust rained down on him, choking him. He scrambled backward, tripping over the stool and falling hard onto the floor behind the register. He scrambled backward on his hands and feet, crab-walking away from the counter just as a ceiling tile directly above the register exploded downward. Debris and fiberboard crashed onto the counter, followed immediately by a pair of legs wearing tattered gray sweatpants, then a torso, then a head. The intruder dropped from the ceiling, landing in a crouch right on top of the counter, right where Keith had been standing seconds ago. Keith shone the light on the figure and screamed. It was the man from the monitor. He was impossibly thin, his ribs showing through a dirty, torn t-shirt. His skin was pale, almost translucent, like he hadn't seen the sun in months. His hair was a matted nest of grease and filth, but it was his face that was the stuff of nightmares. He was smiling, that same wide, broken smile from the camera footage, exposing yellow teeth, but his eyes were wide and focused, locked onto Keith with a look of pure predatory excitement. In his hand, he was holding something. It wasn't a knife, and it wasn't a gun. It was Keith's missing gel pen. He held it like a dagger, gripping it in his fist. "You found me," the man rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves crunching. "Game over, Keith." Keith didn't wait to ask how this man knew his name. He scrambled to his feet, adrenaline flooding his system, giving him a burst of energy. He turned and sprinted towards the front door. He hit the crash bar with his shoulder, expecting the door to fly open, but it didn't budge. He bounced off the glass, pain shooting through his shoulder. He had forgotten in his panic that he had deadbolted the door from the inside hours ago. He fumbled for the lock, his fingers slipping on the metal thumb turn. He risked a glance over his shoulder. The man hadn't chased him yet. Instead, the man had hopped down from the counter with an eerie grace, landing silently on the floor. He was just standing there, in the middle of aisle 1, watching Keith struggle with the lock, his head cocked to the side like a curious bird. "Open it," the man whispered, and the sound carried across the silent store. "Let the dark in." Keith finally got a grip on the deadbolt and twisted it with a loud clack. The lock disengaged. Keith threw his weight against the door again, and this time it swung open, spilling him out onto the concrete sidewalk into the humid night air. Keith didn't stop running. He sprinted towards his car, a beat-up Honda Civic parked under the canopy near Pump 4. He fumbled in his pocket for his keys, pulling them out and jamming the unlock button, but nothing happened. The car didn't beep, the lights didn't flash. Keith ran to the driver's side and jammed the key into the manual lock, twisting it open. He threw himself into the driver's seat and slammed the door, locking it instantly. He jammed the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine cranked, but it didn't catch. Keith screamed in frustration, slamming his hand on the steering wheel. "Come on, come on!" He tried again. Nothing. The car was dead. He looked up through the windshield and saw the man standing in the doorway of the gas station. The man wasn't rushing. He walked slowly out under the bright canopy lights, blinking against the glare. He looked around, sniffing the air, and then his eyes locked onto Keith's car. He started walking towards the car, not running, just walking with a long, loping stride, swinging his arms loosely at his sides. Keith realized with a sinking feeling that the man had probably been watching him for weeks. He knew Keith's routine. He knew which car was his. Maybe he had even done something to the engine while Keith was busy inside stocking shelves. The thought made Keith feel sick. He was trapped in a metal box that wouldn't move. Keith looked around for options. The highway was empty, no headlights in either direction. The gas station was an island of light in a sea of darkness. Behind the station was the endless expanse of the cornfield. The corn stalks were tall, over 6 feet high, a dense jungle of dry leaves. Keith made a split-second decision. He couldn't stay in the car. The man would just break the window. Keith grabbed the tire iron he kept under his passenger seat for protection, opened the car door, and bolted. He didn't run down the highway where he would be exposed in the open. He ran straight for the cornfield behind the building. He hit the edge of the cornfield at full speed, crashing into the stalks. The leaves whipped at his face, cutting his skin like paper cuts. The ground was uneven, dirt clods and furrows tripping him up, but he kept running, pushing deeper into the rows, trying to put as much distance between him and the gas station as possible. He ran until his lungs burned, until he couldn't breathe. He stopped, bending over, hands on his knees, trying to listen over the sound of his own wheezing, jagged breath. Behind him, back towards the station, he heard the rustling. Swish, swish, swish. Someone was coming through the corn, following his path, not running, just walking at a steady, relentless pace. Keith stood up and tried to move quietly, stepping high to avoid crunching the dry stalks. He moved perpendicular to the rows, trying to lose his pursuer in the maze. The night was terrifyingly dark inside the corn. The moon was blocked by the tall stalks. Keith used his phone light sparingly, shielding it with his hand, flashing it only for a second to see the ground, then turning it off to avoid giving away his position. "Keith!" a voice called out from the darkness, not far enough away. "I made you a trophy, Keith! Come see it!" Keith clamped his hand over his mouth, tears streaming down his face. He crouched low, hiding in the dirt between two rows of corn. He knew he couldn't outrun this man in the dark. The man lived in crawl spaces and shadows. This was his element. Keith needed a weapon or help. He looked at his phone. No signal. One bar flickering in and out. He tried to text his girlfriend again. "Help! Gas station! Cornfield guy chasing me!" The message stuck on sending, then failed. Keith suppressed a sob. He heard the rustling get closer. The man was whistling now, a low, tuneless melody that drifted through the corn. It sounded like a nursery rhyme, but distorted. Keith gripped the tire iron so hard his hand cramped. He prepared himself to fight. He was going to swing for the head, and he wasn't going to stop until one of them was not moving. Suddenly, in the distance, back towards the highway, Keith saw a flash of blue light. It strobed against the sky, rhythmic and bright. Then a siren wailed briefly, a whoop-whoop sound, followed by the crunch of gravel. "Police!" Keith had never been so happy to see flashing lights in his life. The text to his girlfriend must have gone through earlier, or maybe the alarm system in the store had triggered when the power was cut. Either way, help was here. Keith stood up and screamed, "I'm here! Help me! I'm in the corn!" He waved his phone light frantically. The whistling stopped. The rustling in the corn stopped abruptly. There was a moment of heavy silence, and then Keith heard the sound of someone moving away fast, retreating deeper into the fields, away from the lights. Keith didn't wait. He turned and ran back towards the blue glow, crashing through the stalks, not caring about the noise. He burst out of the cornfield and into the back lot of the gas station, stumbling onto the pavement. 2 police cruisers were parked out front, lights blazing. Officers were already approaching the open front door of the store, guns drawn. Keith ran around the building, waving his hands. "Officer! Officer!" The police spun around, shouting at him to get on the ground. Keith dropped the tire iron and fell to his knees, hands in the air, sobbing. "He's in the field! He chased me! He was living in the ceiling!" The officers approached him cautiously, cuffing him for safety until they could figure out what was going on. They put him in the back of the cruiser, wrapped in a blanket, while they swept the building and the edge of the field. More backup arrived. A canine unit was called in to track the suspect in the corn. Keith sat in the back of the car, watching the chaos unfold, safe behind the reinforced glass. He watched as the dog barked furiously, straining at its leash, pulling the handler into the cornfield. He watched as they brought out flashlights and long guns, turning the gas station into a command center. An hour later, the canine unit emerged from the field, alone. The dog had tracked the scent for a mile, but lost it at a nearby creek bed. The suspect had vanished into the night. But what the police found inside the gas station, specifically inside the ceiling, proved that Keith wasn't crazy, and it revealed a level of obsession that turned the investigators' stomachs. When the police got a ladder and climbed up into the crawl space above the drop ceiling, they found a nest. It was located directly above the checkout counter, right above where Keith stood for 8 hours every night. The man had arranged fiberglass insulation to make a bed, giving him a comfortable vantage point to look down through the gaps in the tiles. Surrounding the bed were the trophies. Piled up in neat little stacks were all of the items that had gone missing over the last 6 weeks: the bags of chips, the Gatorade bottles, the rusty screws. But there was more. Taped to the ductwork walls were hundreds of Polaroid photos. The police took them down and showed them to Keith later for identification. They were photos of Keith, taken from above, watching him while he worked, watching him while he ate, watching him while he did his homework. Some of the photos were close-ups, zooming in on his face, unaware that he was being observed from 3 feet away. But the most disturbing discovery was found in a small notebook tucked under the makeshift pillow. It was a diary or a logbook written in erratic, scratching handwriting. The entries cataloged Keith's every move. Entry 1. The new one is quiet. He likes cherry soda. He types fast. Entry 12. He looked up today. Almost saw me. Must be more careful. Entry 40. I touched his hair today when he was stalking the cigarettes. He didn't feel it. Keith read that entry and threw up. He remembered that day. He had felt a cobweb brush against his neck and had swatted it away. It wasn't a cobweb. It was the man, hanging down from the ceiling, touching him just to see if he could. The police identified the man from fingerprints found on the soda bottles. His name was Arthur Vance, a fugitive who had escaped from a psychiatric facility in Iowa 3 months prior. Vance had a history of burrowing, hiding in the walls and attics of people's homes, watching them for weeks before eventually making his presence known, usually violently. The police launched a massive manhunt, scouring the cornfields and the surrounding farmhouses, but Arthur Vance was a ghost. He knew how to hide, and he knew the terrain better than they did. He was gone. Keith quit his job that night. Obviously, he never set foot in the Starlight gas station again. He dropped out of that semester of college and moved back home with his parents, unable to sleep in a room by himself for months. He had nightmares about ceiling tiles shifting, about hands reaching down from the darkness. But the story doesn't end there, because 3 months later, Keith received a package in the mail at his parents' house. There was no return address on the envelope, just his name written in block letters. Keith opened it, his hands shaking. Inside was a single object. It was his gel pen, the one the man had been holding that night. Wrapped around the pen was a scrap of paper with a short note scrawled on it. I miss our nights together, Keith. The new guy isn't as fun. Sleep tight. Keith called the police immediately. They traced the postmark on the package. It had been mailed from a town only 20 miles away from where Keith was currently living. Arthur Vance wasn't gone. He had followed Keith. He was still watching. To this day, Arthur Vance has never been caught. Sightings of him pop up every few years, usually in rural areas, usually accompanied by reports of strange noises in attics or items going missing from homes. But he always slips away before police arrive, leaving behind only a messy nest and a feeling of violation. Keith Ryan eventually moved out of state, changed his name, and tries to live a normal life, but he never sits with his back to a room. He never works night shifts, and whenever he walks into a building with a drop ceiling, he can't help but look up, checking the tiles, making sure they are flush, making sure no one is looking back. So the next time you're at a gas station late at night, or sitting in your office, or lying in your bed, look up at the ceiling. Those tiles are just thin pieces of fiberboard. They aren't solid, and there's plenty of space up there for a person to curl up and watch and wait. If you hear a scratching sound above you, don't assume it's rats. And if you lose a pen, maybe just leave it lost. Don't go looking for it, because you might find the person who took it. Thank you for listening to the Cipher Story. If you enjoyed this story and you want to support the channel, please invite the like button over for a sleepover, but then spend the entire night standing in the corner of the room facing the wall without saying a word. Also, please subscribe to the Cipher Story channel on YouTube. We want to grow this community fast, and I love reading your comments. Let me know below. Have you ever worked a night shift and experienced something unexplainable? Or do you have a fear of crawl spaces? I read every comment, and I will be hearting the best ones. If you have a story you want to submit, you can email me at the address in the description below. Until next time, check your locks, check your back seats, and for God's sake, check your ceilings. See ya!